Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, whatever time it is that you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to The Blitz. I am your host, John Edom, lead pastor of Coram Deo Church. This is our maiden voyage. This is the first time, our first episode of this new podcast. So thank you for joining me today. And just a word of warning, it is our maiden voyage. This is going to be like the 15-year-old learning to drive a stick for the first time. It might be a little herky-jerky, but buckle up, hold on. Hopefully we will have some fun together. For this episode, for our very first episode, I want to talk about a comment that I made this last Sunday during our sermon on the first half of Acts chapter 4. Towards the end of the sermon, I made this comment. I said, the world does not need a church that is eager to capitulate to every objection and demand the world makes upon it. The world needs a church that is willing to suffer for the glory of God and for the salvation of the world. And what was behind that comment is a growing concern, a concern that I have had that is growing for years, and it feels like it's just bubbling over now. It is a concern that the church is ugly drunk on the approval of the world. You know, there's tipsy, there's drunk, and then there's ugly drunk. So we're beyond tipsy, we're beyond drunk, we are at the ugly drunk point. What I mean by that is this, that so often our highest priority has become ensuring that whatever we say, whatever we do, however we conduct ourselves, we need to make sure that it is respectable in the sight of our unbelieving neighbors. Now, 100% we need to love our neighbors. However, when our greatest concern, our greatest priority is to make sure that we are respectable in the eyes of our neighbor, all sorts of problems ensue. Consequently, what happens is that the first concern, the first question that we ask is not, what did God say? It's rather, what will my neighbor say? And understand this, if you're concerned about how a neighbor perceives you and you're wondering what should I do, the answer is always obey God. There is never going to be a conflict between obeying God and loving your neighbor. If you obey God, you will love your neighbor. But what is so often happening now, and it's wrapped up in this missional concern and bridge building and all of that. And we need to love our neighbors. We need to understand how we are perceived for sure. But what happens is that that's all that we ask. It dominates everything. What will our neighbors think? So this has been going on for a long time. It's like water that slowly gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then bam, all of a sudden it's boiling, and we're boiling. And I have seen this over and over and over again, especially in the era of COVID insanity with issues of masking and services and not services, and most recently in our state, in Washington State, where our Governor Jay Inslee, has declared that Christians cannot sing at church. So as the governor is making these mandates, a lot of Christians, a lot of pastors are thinking, okay, what do we do, right? Do we enforce these mandates on people who come to church? Should we be singing? Is it okay to sing at church? And what was repeated over and over again was not some argument for the safety or lack thereof of people gathering. What I was hearing again and again and again is this concern. What will our neighbors think? What will the people in our community think if they see the church gathering and, God forbid, singing worship? Christians and leaders and pastors, they say this looks crazy to our neighbors, and here's what I personally heard. Okay, so this is not theoretical, this is what I hear. If the church gathers and doesn't obey all the mandates, and that includes not to sing, if the church gets together and sings, that is going to be a turnoff to our community and our non-believing neighbors regarding the gospel. We're gonna distance people from Jesus because we did wear masks or didn't wear masks, or we didn't distance, or we're gathering to worship. All right? I just want to say, hello, wake up. People are acting as if our communities and our neighborhoods are full of people who are fine with the existence of one God, the triune God of the scriptures, the God of Israel. They're fine with that. They're fine with creation ex nihilo, that God speaks things into existence that did not exist. They are fine with God creating man in his image, male and female, those being God-given realities. They are fine with the exclusivity of Christ, that there is no other way to God. They are fine with issues like the virgin birth, and they are fine with doctrine of the Trinity. They are fine with the deity and the humanity, the hypostatic union of Christ. They are fine with justification by faith alone. They are fine with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's as if they're fine with all that, but the one thing that is going to turn them off from the church and Christianity is not wearing a mask or singing at church. And I just think that is absolutely ridiculous. Those people don't exist. There are not people in our communities who are fine with all of the historical creeds of the church, who believe all that, and they're just looking for a church that will enforce mask, or looking for a church that will not sing. It is absolutely insane to go down that train of thought. And so I've heard that so much, and what I see is the church is so afraid to be seen as anything other than respectable and reasonable in the sight of the world, and it is a huge problem. Now, this problem has existed, it's going on, and about a week or two ago, Christianity Today published an article under a section called The Jesus Creed, which is a blog by Scott McKnight. And in that blog, there's articles written by other people. So they submitted an article, published an article called A Plea and a Warning for Evangelicalism. And it was written by Chris Kugler. And you can go to their website right now and check it out for yourself. A Plea and a Warning for Evangelicalism. That title should put your guard up, okay? So, in this article, Kugler expresses his concern for the church, and he makes statements like this: so much of evangelicalism is at least 30 years behind the curve. The church is 30 years behind the curve. Did you know that? The conservative church, not the liberal church, not the church that is willing to embrace transgenderism and same-sex marriage. The conservative church is at least 30 years behind the curve. Well, one wants to ask the question, what curve? Whose curve is this? When did this curve become authoritative? Did we vote on it? Is there a verse for it? Okay, but according to Kugler, the conservative church is 30 years behind the curve. And then he goes on to identify some of the issues that he has problems with. These are examples that he states that prove the point that the church is 30 years behind the curve. Of those examples, he throws in the issue of young earth creationism and women in ministry. That's two of the four that he mentions: young earth creationism and women in ministry. The young earth creationism is so interesting. People like Tremper Longman III and John Walton have really pushed this idea of reimagining Genesis chapter 1 to the point where Genesis chapter 1 makes no sense unless you have, 15 degrees. And what's so interesting about Genesis chapter 1, I understand there's room for debate, there's room for discussion. People, respectable people who take the Bible seriously can disagree. Here's one question I would just want to throw out there. Did all of the young Hebrew boys that were traveling through the desert, that had left Egypt in Exodus, did those Hebrew boys and girls, did they have a problem with the 6-day creation story? Did they object to it? Genesis 1 was not written for professors. Genesis 1 was written for recently freed Hebrew slaves who were uneducated. It was to instruct them. It was to be understandable by them. Deuteronomy tells us that these are the things that could be taught and discussed along the way, walking from here to there, at a dinner table. I just have a hard time accepting the fact that all of those Hebrew children and all those Hebrew families for years and years and years got Genesis 1 completely wrong, right? Some people will argue that we should not take the genealogies listed in Genesis seriously, that they are incomplete. When you hear people talking about, the earth being 6,000-ish years old, the where they're getting that from is adding the numbers up in the genealogy. And so people will say those genealogies are incomplete. And if we just say, yeah, the genealogies aren't exhaustive, they are incomplete. But are they incomplete by billions of years? Or are they incomplete by hundreds or maybe thousands of years? You see the jump there? Okay. So one of his concerns is young earth creationism. The second one is women in ministry. Women in ministry, in spite of what is clearly taught by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and chapter 3, in which the office of elder is strictly held reserved for biblically qualified men. Kugler is concerned that position, that conservative historical position, is 30 years behind the curve. Agreeing with St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, is 30 years behind the curve. Okay? So those are some of the issues he brings up. And then he goes on to say that he believes that not only is the conservative church 30 years behind the curve, that the conservative church only has 30 years left. Okay, so set your clocks. 2050, the conservative church will be dead. The ironic thing is that when churches embrace liberalism, they die. However, he's arguing that if you stick to a historical, conservative understanding of Scripture, you'll be dead in 30 years. Okay, set your clocks. We'll see if he's right or not. How should the church counter this? How should the church correct itself from this, what he thinks is an unhealthy theological position and teaching, especially on the issue of women in ministry? Okay, he gives us these pointers. Training is important, right? Training is important. You should not sit under a pastor who has no serious biblical or theological training. And there are, of course, he makes this comment, many different kinds of training. So you need to make sure that if you are at a pastor or you're at a church, that the pastor is there, and especially the preaching pastor, has some competency. He knows what he's talking about. He understands the Scripture. That's actually a qualification given by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 3. He doesn't say anything about formal education, but he does say something about the ability to handle the Word. Okay, so we need to sit under pastors who take theology seriously. Agreed on that point. Then he goes on to say, pastors, leaders, such as Sproul and Piper, he also mentions MacArthur, Sproul and Piper are not reliable Bible scholars or theologians. And at this point, you have to scratch your head and go, what is this guy smoking? Sproul and Piper are not reliable Bible scholars or theologians. Are we sure that's true? Are we sure they're not reliable, educated, competent, smart theologians? You know what you can do is you can do a little bit of research on this thing called the internet, and you can find out exactly what kind of education these men have had. John Piper's education includes a degree from Wheaton, where he majored in literature. He minored in philosophy. He has a divinity degree from Fuller. He has a doctorate of theology at the University of Munich. And he had his dissertation while he was at the University of Munich. That dissertation was published by Cambridge. Sounds like a academic, professionally trained kind of dude there. R.C. Sproul Both of these guys have contributed so much to the life of the church. R.C. Sproul, he has a bachelor's from Westminster, a bachelor's from Xenia, I think I'm saying that, Theological Seminary. That is where John Gerstner taught. If you know significant contribution to Christian philosophy, that's John Gerstner. He taught there. He has a doctorate from the Free University of Amsterdam and a PhD from Whitefield Theological Seminary. However, Christianity Today tells you Sproul and Piper are not reliable Bible scholars or theologians. Let me translate that for you. The issue here is not education. The issue here is not training. The issue here is what side of these doctrinal debates you're on. And this, we'll talk about this in future episodes. This is the same thing that happens with the woke train, okay? If you hold to the liberal position, you're educated. And if you don't hold to that position, it is not because you are a reasonable, rational thinking person who has an articulated argument or position that is inconsistent with which is held by others. It is simply because you're stupid. You're uneducated. That's essentially what this article is arguing for. And it falls into that same trap that we started with in this podcast, the desire to be respectable in the eyes of the world. The idea that God created everything out of nothing is not respectable in a world that has embraced scientism, right? That is different than science. Science is a discipline. It is God's grace to our world. There are countless goods that come to us through scientific research and study. Scientism is the belief that science is the ultimate and final authority in all things. Science is able to basically explain all things. Scientism has no room for a supernatural creator being. And so in a world that has embraced scientism, any belief in God is going to seem ridiculous. Any position is going to seem ridiculous. In a world that no longer understands the objective difference between men and women, the idea that God created man and woman in his image, that they have equal value and dignity, and yet God creates them for different purposes, there's no room for that. It will not be respectable. And understand that if you start capitulating on all of these issues, at what point do you give up things like virgin birth? Now you think maybe that sounds crazy. Rob Bell actually begged the question, how important is virgin birth? And it was only a couple years later that he just left the faith completely, and now he worships the God of Oprah. So guys, these things are incredibly important. And we need to make sure that what we are motivated by is not this supreme desire to make sure that everything we say and believe is respected by the world, but to make sure that everything that we say and believe is faithful to the God who created the world. And what happens when a church embraces this? Because this is often the source of suffering and conflict. When a church embraces this, and we see this in the book of Acts, there's a profound impact on the culture. There are people who are converted and they are brought to Christ. I will often refer to a book called The Destroyer of the Gods. It's written by Larry Hurtado. He is looking at the life of the early church, and one of the things that he just stresses over and over again is that the early church was weird. It wasn't respectable in the eyes of the Roman world. What they believed about money and sexuality and the body, those things were ridiculous. They were absurd. Christians were persecuted and chastised for what they believed. They were not respectable in the eyes of the world. But that clear distinction between the church and the world was it created a powerful dynamic. That's what attracted people to the church. When the church looks just like the world has no reason to convert. Why would it convert to something it basically has already embraced? It is the awkwardness of the church. It is the awkwardness in the eyes of the world, I should say. that is both so repugnant to the world, and at the same time, it is the thing that attracts people. So as we close this podcast, our first episode, I would just say, man, take a cold shower, drink your coffee. Let's not be drunk on the world's approval and respect. Let's be a people of the word. Let's stick to the word. Let's obey the word. Let's submit to the word and let the consequences be what they are. Let's trust God, our sovereign God, who is endlessly faithful and good, and trust that he will accomplish his will in and through his church, the local church, even when that church looks ridiculous in the eyes of the world. All right, thanks for tuning in today. Make sure to follow us next week when we get our second episode of The Blitz. Take care.